6 months. That is how long this war has actually been going, longer than most wars people assume are already over. And in the last 72 hours, the President of the United States has said something no sitting American president has said publicly before. Not in a tweet, not in a late-night rant. In an official statement from the White House, he used the word collapse. And then his own Treasury Secretary went on national television and repeated it, word for word, on purpose, in front of the cameras, so nobody could pretend it was a slip of the tongue. If you think you understand where this war is heading, give me the next 25 minutes, because what happened this week changes the entire calculation. And almost nobody watching the mainstream coverage actually understands why. Let's set the scene properly, slowly, and carefully, because context is genuinely everything here, and skipping it is exactly how people end up misreading everything that follows. This war did not start last week. It started on February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched a joint military operation against Iran, aiming to cripple the country's nuclear infrastructure and its ability to project power through its regional proxies. 6 months of strikes. 6 months of the Iranian Navy being gutted, its air force reduced to a shell of what it once was, its military production sites turned into rubble fields, and yet the regime in Tehran is still standing. That is the uncomfortable truth nobody on either side wants to admit out loud. Bombs alone did not finish the job. So this week, Washington changed strategy entirely, and that pivot is what we need to unpack, piece by piece. On Wednesday evening, President Trump posted a statement that read like a declaration of a new kind of war, an economic one. He said no one had given Iran a greater opportunity to make a deal than he had, and that tragically for them, they failed to take it. Then came the line that is now being replayed on every news channel from Al Jazeera to CNBC. He announced what he called the most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country, describing it as economic warfare in isolation on an unprecedented scale. He didn't stop there. He warned that any nation, any bank, any airport, any government entity that continues to give Iran any kind of financial lifeline will itself face what he called tremendous economic consequences. Read that again. This is not just about Iran anymore. This is about every country on earth that still does business with Tehran, directly or indirectly. Then, 2 days later, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stepped in front of the cameras on CNBC and made it official in a way that stunned even seasoned Iran watchers. He said, in almost those exact words, that the goal now is to collapse the regime, not weaken it, not pressure it, collapse it. He called the coming sanctions package the greatest coordinated economic isolation in the history of the world, and then he delivered a line that will be quoted for years if this war ends the way Washington wants it to. You are either with us or against us. If you insist on doing business with them, transferring their money, buying their oil, running their ships, the United States Treasury will use its full might and force against you. Now, why does this matter so much? Because up until this point, the American position, even during 6 months of missiles and airstrikes, had technically never been regime change. That was Israel's stated position. That was the opposition's stated goal. But officially, the White House and the Pentagon kept insisting the mission was narrower. Destroy the nuclear threat, degrade the regime's ability to hurt its neighbors, nothing more. Trump himself had posted angry, informal comments in the past suggesting a new government in Iran might be nice. But angry tweets are not policy. This week, for the first time, the language shifted from the president's personal opinion to an actual operational Treasury campaign with a name, a timeline, and enforcement mechanisms. That is a different animal entirely. Let's also talk about the human layer of this, the part that gets lost the moment a story turns into geopolitics and Treasury statements. There are more than 80 million people living inside Iran right now who did not choose this war, who did not choose the regime that dragged them into it, and who are absorbing the actual cost of every one of these decisions in the form of fuel queues, blackouts, medicine shortages, and a currency that buys less every single week. It is easy, sitting outside the country, to talk about collapse as a strategic outcome, a win condition on a scoreboard. It is a very different thing to be the person standing in line for subsidized bread while your government spends what little hard currency it has left on missiles instead of imports. None of that excuses what the regime has done, to its own people or to the region. But if we're going to talk honestly about this war, we have to hold both truths at once. That pressure on a hostile, nuclear-seeking regime can be strategically necessary, and that the humanitarian cost of an economic siege designed explicitly to trigger collapse from within is not an abstraction. It is measured in real households running out of options. So let's talk about what triggered this shift, because it did not happen in a vacuum. For months, the U.S. Navy has maintained a blockade in the waters around Iran, choking off the country's ability to export oil. And here is the part that should genuinely shock you. Iran's own central bank governor went on state television and admitted it. He said, on the record, that Iran is not exporting oil. Zero. No revenue coming in from what used to be one of the country's only reliable sources of hard currency. Think about the political risk of a senior Iranian official saying that publicly, in a country where saying the wrong thing can end a career or worse. That was not a slip. Analysts believe that admission was deliberately aimed at Beijing, a signal designed to pressure China into stepping up support before the economic pain becomes irreversible. And China's reaction tells you everything about how nervous this situation has actually made the wider world. Beijing came out and rejected Washington's new measures, warning that maximum pressure sanctions will not work. But here is the contradiction worth sitting with for a second. If Chinese officials genuinely believed the sanctions were doomed to fail, why would they bother issuing a formal warning at all? You don't threaten someone over a plan you think is destined to flop. The real reason is simple, and it comes down to oil. China gets roughly half of its energy imports from the Gulf region. Half. When Bessent was asked directly on CNBC whether the new sanctions package would specifically target Chinese entities, he didn't deny it. He said some conversations are better held in private and added almost casually that it would do Beijing a big service to, in his words, get with the program. That is about as close to a direct threat against a superpower as a Treasury Secretary gets on live television. Meanwhile, on the ground, the physical war has not stopped, and this is where the phrase from tonight's headline comes in. Since this conflict began, a wave of fires and explosions has repeatedly struck oil infrastructure connected to Iran and its allies across the region. Back in April, the United Arab Emirates carried out a strike on an Iranian oil facility on Levan Island, hitting it hard enough to cripple output there for months, an act of retaliation after Iranian strikes on Emirati territory. Independent energy analysts have documented a broader pattern too, a cluster of refinery fires and unexplained explosions rippling across multiple countries connected to this wider conflict. Disruptions serious enough that the International Energy Agency recorded a drop of 85 million barrels in global oil inventories in a single month, the sharpest demand contraction the world has seen since COVID. This is not a regional story anymore. This is a global energy shock, and Iran's oil sector sits right at the center of it. Now here's what makes this new economic phase genuinely different from 6 months of airstrikes. Bessent himself said something on that same CNBC appearance that deserves far more attention than it got. He suggested that if the maximum economic pressure campaign works the way Washington hopes, there likely will not be a need to restart large-scale military operations. Read between the lines there. That is the Treasury Secretary of the United States saying in public that the plan now is to strangle the regime financially rather than keep bombing it. Whether that's a genuine strategic pivot or a signal meant to keep oil markets from panicking is something we'll only know with time. But it tells you Washington understands something important. Bombs got them 6 months into this war without a collapse. Money might finish what missiles could not. Of course, Iran is not sitting quietly through any of this. Foreign Minister Abbas IRGC fired back almost immediately, calling the entire campaign a diversion, arguing that the real crisis is American, not Iranian, pointing to the fact that the United States' national debt crossed $40 trillion this same week. He posted that doubling down on failed policies will only bring further defeat, and accused Washington of what he called economic terrorism. It's worth pausing on that word choice for a second, because in this conflict, in this decade honestly, the word terrorism gets thrown around by every side to describe whatever the other side is doing that they don't like. Iran's deputy foreign minister, Kazem Garibabadi, went further, arguing that Trump's threats matter less and less as the war drags past the 6-month mark, without a clear winner on the battlefield. And here's a detail that should reframe how you think about this entire situation. The head of Iran's armed forces, Major General Ali Abdullahi, responded to the new sanctions not with de-escalation, but with a direct warning, saying Tehran is prepared to respond with what he called a crushing, punishing, and devastating reaction across land, sea, air, and cyberspace. That is not the language of a government quietly accepting economic collapse. That is a regime signaling it still believes it has cards left to play, whether through its proxy network, cyber capabilities, or renewed disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important oil choke point on the planet, through which roughly a fifth of the world's crude and liquefied natural gas normally flows. There's a market dimension to all of this that most viewers never see, because it doesn't show up in dramatic footage. It shows up in spreadsheets and inventory reports. Energy analysts tracking this war have documented a genuinely unusual pattern over the past several months. A cluster of refinery fires, power plant explosions, and suspected sabotage incidents rippling across countries with no direct connection to the Iran war at all, from a Chevron refinery fire in California to a major blaze at an oil terminal in Tuapse, Russia, to a refinery fire in India that delayed a facility the country urgently needed to offset disruptions caused by the Strait of Hormuz being contested. Some of these incidents have confirmed military origins, Others are still being investigated as industrial accidents. But taken together, energy researchers say they point to something bigger than any single explosion. A global energy system already stretched thin by the Iran war and Hormuz disruptions, now operating with almost no margin for error, where aging infrastructure and reduced maintenance mean even a small equipment failure on the other side of the planet can ripple into the same headlines as an actual airstrike. The International Energy Agency has recorded the sharpest contraction in oil demand since the COVID pandemic, and Europe has responded by launching an $86 billion clean energy strategy, specifically framed around reducing exposure to exactly this kind of shock. This is the part of the war that never trends on social media, but it's arguably reshaping global energy policy faster than any single battlefield event this year. Let's talk about the regional dominoes, because this is not staying contained to Washington and Tehran. The United Arab Emirates announced this week that it is halting all trade with Iran, a direct response to renewed ballistic missile strikes it says came from Iranian-aligned forces. That is a major Gulf economy, a country that has spent years quietly hedging its relationship with Tehran, now cutting ties publicly in the middle of an economic war. When a state like the UAE, which has enormous financial incentive to stay neutral and keep its ports and banks open to everyone, decides the risk of dealing with Iran is no longer worth it, that tells you something about how the regional temperature has changed. Fence-sitting is becoming harder and harder to justify. And there's a military dimension happening quietly in the background that most people have missed entirely. The USS George Washington, an American aircraft carrier strike group, has now arrived in the Middle East, relieving the USS Lincoln, which had been deployed for an unusually long stretch, long enough that reports emerged about deteriorating conditions and worsening morale among the crew after months at sea. Think about what that rotation tells you. The United States is not winding this down. It is refreshing its naval presence in the region for what could be a long haul, even while its Treasury Secretary talks about avoiding another large-scale combat restart. Those two signals, a fresh carrier group arriving, and public talk of economic rather than military solutions, sound contradictory on the surface, but they might actually be two halves of the exact same strategy. Keep the military option visibly ready. Let the economic weapon do the actual damage. Never let Tehran believe the pressure is only coming from one direction. Now let's zoom out on the money question, because this is genuinely the most interesting part of the entire story if you actually sit with the numbers. Bessent published an opinion piece over the weekend describing the coming campaign as, in his words, the single greatest financial offensive ever marshaled against an adversary. That is not modest language. That is a Treasury Secretary essentially declaring economic war, using the same rhetorical weight usually reserved for military invasions. And the mechanics of it matter. This isn't just about freezing a handful of accounts belonging to Iranian officials. The stated plan targets oil sales, banking channels, shipping registries, and any foreign company or government facilitating what officials describe as Iran's ability to participate in the global economy at all. If executed the way it's being described, this would functionally attempt to cut Iran off from the entire international financial system, not just American markets. But here's the honest complication nobody in this story wants to say out loud. Sanctions campaigns like this have been tried before against other regimes, and the results have been mixed at best. Cuba has lived under an American embargo for over 6 decades, and its government is still standing. Venezuela has weathered years of maximum pressure sanctions, and Maduro remains in power. Bessent himself referenced both of those examples directly, arguing that the blockade approach worked in Venezuela and is currently working in Cuba, and insisting it will work in Iran too. That comparison should make you pause rather than nod along, because depending on how you define working, those two case studies could just as easily be used as evidence that authoritarian governments can survive extraordinarily long under sustained economic siege, especially when they have outside patrons willing to prop them up. And that brings us right back to China. Because if Beijing decides propping up Tehran is worth the diplomatic and economic cost, this entire strategy could stretch out for years, rather than months. Let's widen the lens a bit further, because this war has never been contained to just Iran, Israel, and Washington, and this week is proof of exactly that. Yemen has become its own front in this fight. Since late March, the Houthi movement, which had paused its attacks on Israel after the previous Gaza ceasefire, resumed launching ballistic missiles at Israeli territory and formally joined this war on Iran's side. But the more explosive development is what happened afterward, because in mid-July, the Houthis moved from targeting Israel to directly confronting Saudi Arabia, imposing what amounts to a naval blockade against the kingdom and triggering the kind of tit-for-tat escalation that threatens to unravel the fragile ceasefire that had kept Yemen's civil war frozen since 2022. Reporting throughout August described Houthi missile and drone attacks striking Yemeni government strongholds in Marib and Hadramaut, with government casualties in the dozens in single incidents, and separate Houthi drone strikes hitting a Saudi Aramco refinery in Jazan not once but twice within the same week. Saudi Arabia, for its part, has reportedly been preparing for a renewed ground and naval offensive against the Houthis, something that would effectively reopen a war that had gone quiet for years. So when people say this conflict could spiral into something bigger than Iran, this is exactly the mechanism they're pointing to. A frozen civil war in Yemen, thawed out by a wider regional fight, now dragging Saudi Arabia into direct confrontation with an Iran-backed militia at the exact moment Washington is trying to choke off Tehran's finances. And it isn't only the Gulf and the Red Sea. Just this week, tensions exploded almost literally on an entirely different front. Syria. Israel struck a Syrian military airbase near Aleppo, a facility it said was being prepared to host Turkish forces, and framed the strike as enforcement of a security understanding it says Damascus was about to breach. Turkey did not take that quietly. Ankara called the strikes reckless and an unnecessary escalation, and Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz posted a pointed warning directed at President Erdogan personally, cautioning him against what Katz called dragging Turkey into dangerous adventures in Syria and testing Israel's resolve to defend itself. The United States, caught in the middle of two of its own regional partners, has reportedly been scrambling behind the scenes to prevent this from boiling over into a direct Israeli-Turkish clash, with American diplomats publicly calling the strikes an unnecessary escalation, even as they work quietly to keep both sides from further action. Some analysts in Jerusalem are now openly discussing the possibility of a future confrontation between Israel and Turkey over Syria, describing it as a potential successor conflict to the fading Iranian-led Axis, this time framed around Turkish-aligned influence in Damascus rather than Iranian-aligned militias. Whether or not that escalates further, it tells you something important about the moment we're in. This is not a clean, contained war between two governments. It's a pressure cooker with multiple lids, and every one of them is rattling at the same time. There's also a piece of this story that deserves real scrutiny rather than blind repetition, and it's about how information itself is being weaponized in this conflict. Independent reporting has raised skepticism about competing claims from both sides about what is actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, with some outlets suggesting oil is still moving through a so-called stealth corridor despite the blockade, and others pushing back hard on that claim. Prediction markets tracking. Whether Hormuz traffic returns to normal by the end of September are showing overwhelming skepticism, with the vast majority betting against a return to normal shipping in that time frame. When traders who have actual money on the line are that pessimistic, that tells you something. Markets believe that press conferences alone cannot. So where does that leave us? 6 months into a war that started with missiles and has now evolved into what may become the largest coordinated financial siege of a nation in modern history. A Treasury Secretary using the word collapse on live television without flinching. A central bank governor in Tehran admitting defeat on state media in a way that looks less like an accident and more like a calculated signal to Beijing. China publicly rejecting sanctions it's simultaneously worried enough about to formally condemn. The UAE cutting economic ties. A fresh American carrier group rotating into the region, even as officials talk publicly about avoiding another large-scale military escalation. And underneath all of it, ordinary Iranians, who have spent 6 months living through blackouts, oil shortages, and a currency that has been steadily hollowed out, caught between a regime unwilling to fold and an international pressure campaign that openly states its goal is regime collapse rather than mere behavior change. There's a midterm election calculation sitting quietly underneath all of this, too, and it's worth naming honestly. Analysts covering this administration have pointed out that how this war is perceived by American voters matters enormously heading into the next election cycle. An economic squeeze that visibly weakens a hostile regime without American casualties is, politically speaking, close to an ideal outcome for whoever is in the White House. A renewed shooting war with new casualties, less so. That doesn't mean the economic pressure campaign isn't genuine or strategically sound. It just means you should watch for how carefully Washington manages the narrative between now and election season. Because the political incentives and the strategic incentives happen to be pointing in the exact same direction right now, and that alignment is worth remembering every time you see a new headline out of this conflict. There's one more thread worth pulling before we get to where this leaves us, and it's about the internal Iranian power structure itself, because a regime under this much external pressure does not stay static internally either. Analysts who track Iran's clerical and military establishment have pointed to a gradual but real shift in influence away from the traditional clerical hierarchy that has run the country's key institutions since 1979, and toward the military and security apparatus built around the Revolutionary Guard. This is not unusual behavior for authoritarian systems under sustained siege. When the normal channels of legitimacy, elections, religious authority, or economic performance stop delivering results, The actors who control the guns and the intelligence services tend to accumulate more practical power, regardless of what the formal constitutional structure says on paper. Whether that shift accelerates the war's end or actually hardens Tehran's resistance is genuinely uncertain, because a security establishment that owes its authority to the war itself has very little incentive to be the one that surrenders. That's worth remembering every time you hear a hopeful prediction about an imminent Iranian collapse. The people closest to the actual levers of power inside Iran right now may be the ones with the strongest personal interest in this war continuing rather than ending. What happens next likely depends on three things converging at once. First, whether the blockade genuinely stops Iranian oil exports at the scale officials claim, or whether alternate routes, discounted sales to willing buyers, and quiet workarounds keep just enough revenue flowing to keep the regime functional. Second, whether China calculates that continuing to prop up Tehran is worth the cost of direct confrontation with Washington's treasury, or whether Beijing quietly begins to pull back rather than risk its own access to Gulf oil and Western financial markets. And third, whether Iran's military and clerical leadership, already reportedly experiencing internal power shifts since the war began, can hold together long enough to outlast a financial siege that its own central bank governor has already all but admitted is working. None of those three questions have clear answers yet, and it's worth resisting the temptation to pretend otherwise, just because a confident answer makes for a cleaner story. Every side in this conflict has an incentive to project certainty it does not actually possess. Washington wants markets and allies to believe the collapse is inevitable, so that wavering countries fall in line early rather than late. Tehran wants its own population and its remaining partners to believe the pressure is survivable, that outlasting 6 months of war means outlasting whatever comes next, too. Beijing wants to look unmoved without actually testing how far it's willing to go to protect its energy interests. And frankly, plenty of commentary channels covering this war, on every side of the political spectrum, have an incentive to make every development sound like the final turning point, because that's what keeps people watching. The responsible position, the one that actually respects your intelligence as a viewer, is to say plainly that this is a fluid, dangerous, multi-front situation, where the direction of travel has clearly shifted toward economic strangulation this week, but where the timeline and the final outcome remain genuinely open. What is clear is that the language coming out of Washington this week represents a genuine escalation, not just rhetorically, but structurally, in how this war is being fought. 6 months of missiles bought time and degraded capability, but did not deliver collapse. Now the United States government, on the record, through its Treasury Secretary, has said the objective is not containment anymore. It is collapse. Full stop. Whether that objective is achievable through sanctions alone, whether it triggers a desperate and dangerous escalation from a cornered regime that still controls the Strait of Hormuz, or whether it grinds on for years the way Cuba and Venezuela have, is genuinely one of the most consequential open questions in the world right now. One last thing worth sitting with before we close this out. Wars like this rarely end the way either side originally scripted them. The Americans and Israelis who launched this campaign in February expected a faster outcome than 6 months and counting. The Iranian leadership that dismissed early warnings almost certainly did not expect its own central bank governor to admit total oil export failure on state television, or its neighbors in the UAE to formally cut trade ties, or a second front to open up in Yemen against Saudi Arabia, or Israel and Turkey to be trading warnings over an airbase in Syria in the same news cycle. Every actor in this conflict is currently improvising against a reality that has already outpaced their original assumptions, and that is precisely what makes predicting the next month, let alone the next year, so difficult. The honest answer to where this goes next is that nobody fully knows, not the analysts, not the traders on those prediction markets, and almost certainly not the officials making these announcements themselves. What we can say with confidence is that the language shifted this week from containment to collapse, that the mechanism shifted from missiles to money, and that the number of countries with something at stake in how this ends just kept growing. That is the story underneath the headline, and it is far more important than any single explosion or press conference, because it tells you this war has entered a phase where the outcome will be decided as much in banking systems and shipping lanes as it will be on any battlefield. If this breakdown actually helped you understand what's happening beyond the headlines, that's exactly why I put these together, because most coverage of this war either oversimplifies it into pure military updates or buries the real story under noise. Subscribe if you want the next update the moment there's real movement, whether that's on the Hormuz shipping question, a Chinese response, or the next escalation from Tehran. Because, judging by the pace of the last 72 hours alone, we are not going to be waiting long for the next major development in this story. And that's really the mindset worth carrying forward as this story keeps developing over the coming weeks. Don't anchor to the loudest headline of any given day, whether it's a dramatic quote from a Treasury Secretary, an angry post from a foreign minister, or a viral clip claiming a single explosion changes everything. Anchor instead to the pattern underneath all of it, the direction the pressure is actually moving in, who is gaining leverage and who is losing it, and which of today's confident predictions get quietly walked back a month from now. That's the only way to actually track a conflict this complicated without getting swept up in whichever narrative is trending on a given afternoon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.